Dan.
to the Domestic Draft Podcast. I'm Evan Bierman here with Dan Slope. We got a special episode today. We're going to be talking about Schilling Cider. I'm really excited. Schilling Cider just launched the newest addition to their Big Zesty Lemonade cider family. It's Big Zesty Raspberry Lemonade. Dan, it looks like you got it right there.
I
So why don't you tell the
do.
people about it?
Hard cider made with fresh pressed apples, blend of lime, raspberry, lemon juice. It's 6.9%. And it's got a 3.83 on Untapped. And Evan, I see you're drinking some there as well. It's nice that it's a tall boy too. I'm enjoying this. It's going to be a nice show. Evan, what do you got?
Yeah. So I have the Big Zesty Guava Lemonade. So trying a couple different flavors here. If you haven't heard of Schilling Cider, they're the nation's largest fresh pressed cidery and second largest producer of cider by volume. But here to tell us more is our next guest. It's the CEO, co-founder, and Master Cider Maker at Schilling Cider, Colin Schilling. Colin, thanks so much for joining us.
What's up, Dan, Evan? Thanks for having me. Stoked to be here.
Yeah, appreciate you being here and spending some time with us. So we're curious. We read a little bit about you, did some research, but we want to hear the story. So how'd this all start? It seems like this has been in your blood, at least being some sort of an entrepreneur and a craftsman. So how did the story of Schilling Cider start?
Yeah, totally. So I have to go way back for this, but I grew up in northern Idaho on a bunch of acreage way outside of town. We had a bunch of super old apple trees that are, 80 plus feet tall. And I grew up, in a family that grew a lot of our own food and kind of were, not totally off grid, but were, pretty self-sufficient. And we picked those trees every year, and my parents would take it in the back of the truck, press it, and make what they would call cider. It was not the best of cider, but it would get you drunk and get the job done. And it was something I'd been around, for a long time as a kid and watched it and really appreciated the craft of it. And so I went out and bought a few books on winemaking and beer making and kind of figured out what could improve that process, as opposed to just pressing the fruit, forgetting about it for 6 months and coming back and hoping it was good. Is how do you introduce some science and some, more precision to that process. And so I grew up doing it, again, I can't admit to the age at which I was doing that, but we're talking small volumes here, more around the science of it. And I went off to college and was, at that time drinking some of the bigger brands that were coming on the market at the time. And I just thought, it's great to see cider having a resurgence, but I really wish people could enjoy the kind of cider I like making. And, being up here in Washington State, we grow a huge portion of the country's apples. And so we just have such an abundance of really high quality fruit right in our backyard. It really seemed like something that made a lot of sense to come out and start a cider company doing, fresh pressed juice based ciders, but also, making it more approachable. So we were one of the first cideries in the country to put it in cans and really approach cider making and cider selling kind of in the craft beer realm of make a really high quality product, but make it approachable, versus the other, kind of segment of cider, which is also beautiful and awesome, but it's more of that kind of wine style where you're buying a 750 ml glass bottle and it's awesome cider, but you're usually 20 or 30 bucks a bottle versus a beer priced 6-pack that's a little more approachable. And so, that's really what we focused on. And you're trying some cider all the way down in San Diego. So obviously we've made our mark on kind of the cider world, and it's great to be here. And I'm really stoked to be able to continue to share our amazing cider in a farther out, distance.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I was reading, I guess this is a fast fact for our listeners. If you don't know, Washington actually produces the most apples in the country, right? Followed by, I think, New York and Michigan are the next couple. But I thought that was really interesting too, that you go from, picking these apples out in Washington to making the cider that you can distribute throughout the country. Now, you worked at Microsoft for a little bit, right? What happened there, and why did you leave so suddenly?
Was it that bad?
No comment, no shade thrown. No, I enjoyed my time there, but so I went to grad school. I got my MBA, and I was making cider in my dorm room and in my house the whole time. And it was always been a passion of mine. But obviously the idea was go out, get a job, make some money, learn how the world works, learn how business models work. And that was what the goal was working with Microsoft. So I was in the consulting arm, doing ERP and things like that. And, for me, it was an interesting time because, this is 2013 when the economy was not doing very well. So jobs were pretty limited, especially for folks like myself just coming out of college. And I was very fortunate to get a job, and it was a great job, and Microsoft's a fantastic company. But I'm sitting here, at my kind of most eager time in my career, just chomping at the bit. And, quite frankly, there weren't a lot of things going on in that world at that time. It was just pretty depressed from an economic standpoint. And so it just made sense to, go out and try something when I'm young and dumb and don't have a lot of responsibilities, right? No kids, low rent, I can, feed myself pretty cheap if I need to. And so it just made sense to go out and try this. And so cider at the time had really been upticking. You saw Angry Orchard coming on the scene from Boston Beer. And, they were blowing up. And again, like I told you before, it just made sense for us to say, hey, well, we're in Washington. We make really good quality cider. I think we can kind of go toe to toe with some of these national players. And, fast forward 10 years later, and now we kind of are. Awesome. Obviously they're still a lot bigger than us, but, we're making cider what I feel is the right way, from fresh pressed juice, really high quality ingredients, and really focusing on that flavor forward profile. Everything's kind of turned up to 11 with us, and that's how I like it. And obviously a lot of people like that as well.
It's tasty.
Yeah.
Thank you.
What for people listening, and I'm curious myself, I know Evan does some home brewing and does his own beer, but what's home cidering? Is that what you would call it? Home cidering?
Well, that's
what's
a whole can of worms
purest
right there.
process? Yeah. Like what's the process of doing that?
Yeah, home cider making, I guess, if you want the technical term. A lot of people call it home brewing cider, but that doesn't really make sense because you're not brewing anything per se.
Sure.
At the front end of cider, it's much more like a wine process, and at the back end of cider, it's much more like a beer process. So it really is a hybrid between the two. If you're home making cider, the key is finding good fruit, pressing that fruit, and also keeping everything super clean, just like a brewery. I mean, cleanliness is one of the most important aspects of making a quality, consistent product in the beverage world. But you can make some really nice things at home. It gets tricky though on the back end when you talk about putting something in a can or in a bottle, because you inherently have some residual sugar left over with cider, which you generally don't have with beer, and that will re-ferment. And so that's the trick, is how do you keep your cider consistent, shelf stable, able to travel over long distances, to get to consumers like yourselves. And for us, it's pasteurization. And in our case, it's an 88-foot long by 12-foot wide tunnel pasteurizer. So as those cans are coming off of the canning line, they're going into this pasteurizer, and it just heats it up and then holds it at a certain temp and then cools it back down. And so that allows us to make really awesome, really flavorful cider with no preservatives whatsoever. It's just a heat process. So it's kind of similar, like if you're making pickles or something like that at home, where you're home canning, but it's just on a much larger, much more consistent scale with all sorts of QC checks built in. And so, that is one aspect of how we've grown so successfully, I think, is because we've always focused on innovation through technology and investing and building the very best equipment so that we can continue to grow. But instead of a lot of, or some companies, that have grown and their quality suffers as they grow, our goal is to always get better as we grow. So we can afford better equipment, we can afford better processes, we can afford better lab equipment. And so at every step of our growth, we've really focused on being better than we were before. And I think that's been a really nice mentality for our growth. And it really allowed us to continue to be super consistent and super high quality.
And have the world's fastest canning line.
It's one of the world's fastest canning lines.
So I love the cans. I love the brand and the images. You got this great art. Was this you that came up with this local art? Because we've had brewers that have come on that are like, oh yeah, I just drew this up and it turned into this bigger thing. Or did you have somebody maybe in the local community that came up with this stuff? Like, where did you get the characters that are on each of the cans? What's
Great
the story
question.
there?
And thank you for the flattery, but no, I'm not that skilled as an artist. I wish I was. So the evolution of the branding. So if you go way, way back, so my great-great-grandfather started Schilling Spice Company, no relation to Schilling Cider Company today, but our actually very original branding was a throwback to kind of like late 1800s, early 1900s Schilling Spice Company branding. That was actually a California company, started in the Bay Area. And it turned out that nobody cared about that. And so we just started experimenting. And that's, kind of what the best entrepreneurs do, in my opinion, is they try a lot of things. They try not to fail at anything twice, and they see what works and see what doesn't. And so we had a brilliant head of marketing and designer early on in the company. And she's just like, hey, can I try something wild? Can we try some designs here? And so we did. And it turned out people like that a lot better than our, retro old school branding. And so we've really continued with that. And we've had some amazingly talented folks that have worked for us and continue to work for us. And all of our design work is done in-house. And we continue to, push the boundaries of what, you can put on a can in terms of technical, and obviously, making the art as fun, as intriguing as possible, but also still telling the story of what the cider is. Because at the end of the day, you got to notice it to grab it off the shelf, but the liquid inside has to be absolutely top notch as well. And so it's focusing on those two things and getting that marriage just right between those two aspects.
Yeah, it felt right taking this can, the raspberry lemonade on the beach this weekend. It's got, the koala bear with the Hawaiian shirt on the beach. It was like a perfect marriage. I'm curious about with my favorite apple, I don't know if it's a good thing or not, but I've been absolutely loving Cosmic apples. They're in my local grocery store. I'm pretty sure it's a crossbreed, that this company was able to like have this great apple that kind of is like a honey crisp, kind of like I don't know, Fiji or something. Is that something that you're like closely monitoring? Are these people or these farms that are crossbreeding apples and looking for like the perfect apple for your cider? And does that make it like difficult for you, or is that like the mad scientist where you're like, you can't wait for like this new variation to develop?
Yeah, the consistency. Does that
Right.
stay true
Yeah,
with everything?
That's a great question. There are always new apples coming out, and a lot of times, they're pretty limited when they first come out. They propagate them up. It takes a long time to plant all those trees and see them come to fruition and the kind of fruit volumes that you see them in the stores. We've actually experimented with one that's really cool called the Lucy Glow and Lucy Rose apples. And it's a cross between a Honeycrisp and an Arley Red Flesh, which is a traditional European cider fruit that's red inside. So when you cut these apples open, they have kind of a star pattern of red inside. They're super beautiful. They have this amazing aroma. But for us, when we're making things that need to be super consistent, the reality is we're buying from different orchards and different blends of apples throughout the year. So we actually work really closely with our partners in Eastern Washington to make as consistent of blends as possible. But the reality is those blends of apples actually change every single time we're doing a pressing. But the key is to get that as consistent as possible. And so the trick is getting the right blend of apples. But even if you have one particular type of apple, it may change depending on where it was grown or what time you're pressing it. So there's just a lot of variables there. And that's kind of the secret sauce in making things super consistent, is how you can take an agricultural product that's inherently never the same as what you got last time, and then making that really high quality with all those aspects that you want. So we really focus on specs for those things. So what's the aroma, what's the flavor profile, what's the acid profile, what's the color, what's the turbidity, all those kind of things. And then, working with our partners over there to make sure we're getting the very best fruit, even if it is different than what we got previously.
Love it. And just looking at your can too, I enjoyed. I've never seen this before. Maybe it's because I'm not drinking a lot of canned cider, but you have scales on the side of this can that goes from dry to sweet, and it gives you like the percentage of where they're at. Smooth to sharp, still to sparkling. And I read somewhere you got about 35 taps of ciders at your tap room. Are you in favor of one or the other, like a dry to a sweet, smooth to a sharp, or still to sparkling, or do you try to hit all of that?
I'm not a fan of one or the other. I like everything under the sun for cider. But I think when we started as a craft cidery, it was an era where there weren't a lot of craft cideries yet. And so the real challenge with our industry is education. Craft beers had a long time, and they've done a phenomenal job of, educating people on what the metrics are and what the differences are between craft beer, between IBUs, different types of hops, different types of malts, processes, things like that. But in the cider world, there's a lot less known about it. And so we're really about education and obviously creating a high quality product. But if you look at those three pieces here, so dry to sweet is your Brix scale. So in beer, a lot of people call that specific gravity. Us winemaker, influence folks tend to like Brix a little bit more, but it's all the same thing. It's basically a measure of sweetness. And so dry to sweet. And ciders are going to be better, drier, or sweeter depending on what the flavor profile is, in my opinion. So if something's more fruity, more sour, like obviously a raspberry lemonade is, it's going to benefit from just a little bit more sugar. Just like with, a double IPA, something that's high alcohol and very bitter, it's going to have more residual, well, not residual, but it's going to have more sweetness in there, more remaining specific gravity to help balance that out. Otherwise, it's, just too bitter and too tart in some cases, like this one would be. Acid's the same thing. So the higher acid, the more sharp the taste is going to be, but you're also going to need some other things to balance that out. And then the same with carbonation on that other spec. So there are some, I won't get into the nerdy details, but there's some legal things around carbonation where you're allowed to carb too as well. It's kind of crazy, but we fall under wine laws, so we get some crazier regulation than some of the beer folks deal with. But we also have some technology on a few of our ciders to go super high carb. So we have some of the highest carb cider in a can on some of our drier ciders. And that's, again, that innovation that I was talking about earlier that we've invested in to allow us to be able to do that.
Interesting. I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
Well, let's get a little take a tour.
Yeah, definitely.
I want to check this out. Let's get a little technical here though, because I know, when home brewing, I'm sure cider, making cider is the same way, involves a lot of experimentation. Are there any like unconventional ingredients or techniques you maybe have used over the years here? It's been 10 years to create some kind of distinctive cider, and maybe any flavors that you tested that just, you really wanted to work and just didn't work out.
Oh man, I got a great example for that. We are the first and maybe only cidery to ever do a cold brew coffee nitro cider in a can that actually poured nitro. And from a technical perspective, that was truly insane. So we bought a whole bunch of really nice Brazilian coffee, had it custom roasted, extracted it into a cold brew. The proteins in the cold brew help bind with nitrogen, which in a cider, there's generally nothing to bind nitrogen to, like you can in a beer with proteins in beer. And so the coffee allowed us to get enough nitrogen dissolved in the product that then when you would give it a hard pour, it would pour out and have a full nitro head that would sit there just like a Guinness for 10 minutes. And for a cider, that's literally impossible in a normal cider. And it turned out that about half of customers absolutely loved it and thought it was super cool. And the other half absolutely hated it. And if you put a product like that in the store, it's not going to do very well because you've got, the half that loves it versus the half that hate it. You know how that goes down. So, but from a technical standpoint, it was a super cool cider. It was called the Grumpy Bear, and it had a big picture of a bear on the front of it.
Oh man. So do you have that at like the tasting room or anything still, or was that one that you just put out of commission because you were, only 50% of the customers?
It's in the
trophy
room.
Gone. Yeah, that's in the trophy room. It was also so hard to make. It just wasn't worth it. But like you talked about, you got to experiment, you got to try things, you got to push the boundaries, and you're not always going to win. It's not always going to work, but that's part of learning and growing for sure.
Yeah. So I just want to talk about cider as a whole. I know growing up, my influence was, going over to Europe and kind of seeing how popular and prevalent it was over there in bars and pubs of people drinking it. And then coming back to the States, it's just such a heavy beer dominant country. And now in California, in Southern California, I'm seeing a lot of like hard kombucha. So there's a lot of beverages all over the place. And I'm just curious, how are we feeling about cider? Is there a lot of and there's even like a new one down the street, Serpentine Cider, that's just opened up. Is it like on the rise? Are you guys all kind of like, helping each other like take over and being supportive of one another? Because it is, I'm sure, a very competitive field.
Yeah, I'm a big All Boats fan or All Boats Rise person myself. We do a huge amount of support for other cideries in the industry. So those two cider bars you mentioned, we have one with 32 taps and one with 50 taps down in Portland. And the whole idea behind that is to serve other craft ciders at those locations. So we might only be 15 or 20% of the tap list, and the rest are our colleagues in cider. And again, we're really focusing on educating folks about cider. So you can come in and try all sorts of stuff that, maybe Schilling didn't make. But obviously the goal is to grow the category. And like you said, in Europe, it might be 5, 10, 15% of total alcohol. And in the US, it's still about 2% overall. But if you look at various regions around the country, like the Pacific Northwest is 6 or 7%. Because we have a lot of apples up here, but we also have some of the original, bigger regional cideries like Schilling and a few others that have really done a lot of education and made some really amazing products over the years. But I'm also a huge fan of hard kombucha and anything else that's really a craft beverage, pushing the boundaries. That's not necessarily, a big multinational corporation pushing another kind of like sugar water flavor product. Yeah. But, if you look at beverage in general right now, I think cider is really poised for continued growth because a lot of consumers are seeking things out that are full flavor, but are also authentic. And I think, hard kombucha does that in a nice way. In San Diego, it's obviously huge. You got some really amazing companies down there. But cider also has that same story of being, produced by smaller companies that are craft focused, that are really doing a lot of high quality ingredients. And, and you look at the Big Zesty lemonade, for example. This is our second. You were drinking, Evan, the guava, and Dan, you've got the raspberry, which is the second one in the series. And I think the thing that's so interesting about this is there's a bunch of really big, hard lemonade brands that sell a ton of volume, but there's really not much fruit in those. I mean, I let the consumer look at the can for themselves, but that's what's so interesting. If you think about, drinking lemonade growing up, just regular lemonade, you squeeze the lemon juice, you put some sugar in there, you might add raspberry juice to it, and that's it, right? And so that's kind of our approach to making a lemonade, and specifically with the Big Zesty family. These things are almost 100% fruit. So it's just such an authentic product that I think we can extend ourselves into some other categories of hard beverage in a really authentic and awesome way with, fruit base, using real fruit juices and, and just creating an authentic product that way.
Love it.
So safe to say you're not going to have like Angry Orchard or Woodchuck or anything like that on your tap
no,
list.
our rules are it's got to be independently owned and made with 100% fresh pressed juice. I love it. There are some other ways to make cider, and you won't find those ones in our tap rooms.
Do you have
Nice.
any of the one? I know there was the cider bar in Chicago, Evan. I don't know if you've ever been there, but they did the old school. I believe it was like the French form of doing it, to where they'd pour because they used to have
Spanish
like a
style.
or Spanish style. They pour it
Yeah.
like from like 20 feet up, and that's how it like carbonates naturally. And there's a pedal on the floor, and it'll just like flow from the ceiling basically to your cup all the way at the ground. Does Schilling do anything like that?
We do sell a lot of that cider and I love it. It's kind of like, obviously y'all are beer folks. It's kind of like the sour beer world. It's just, minus 20 years. So if you're drinking sour beer in the US 20 years ago, you're way ahead of your time. But a lot of that cider comes from the Asturias region of Spain, and they have one of the oldest cider making traditions in the world. And it's, it's exact opposite of how Schilling does it. It's in open wood casks. You're not washing those things. You're just putting more cider on and letting it do its thing. And you get this really like sour, but really intricate cider that's extremely dry and flat. It's not carbonated. So that pouring technique, like you talked about, essentially you want to get some air bubbles dissolved in that product. And then the idea is you drink the entire cup, before the air bubbles are dispersed. So you pour pretty small pours and then you drink it, you drink the whole cup.
Okay.
Amazing ciders, not exactly the flavor profile that your, average American's going to be intrigued by. But it's definitely kind of like, once you've been through all other ciders, it's a beautiful, amazingly complex subset of ciders, which I personally enjoy, but I certainly don't start someone there on their cider journey.
It's for the pros only.
Yeah.
But beginners, you guys offer cider making classes, right? And I'm wondering what that looks like, and if there's any other classes or events maybe that you offer at your spaces.
Yeah, we used to do a bunch of those, especially before, COVID shutdowns and things. And we're getting back into doing more and more events. You got to forgive my crazy cat over here. She wants to be on the podcast as well.
I thought that was my kid for a second.
Probably just as loud. Yeah, so what we would do is we bring in fresh pressed juice, and we would set people up with just a growler of juice. And then there's a bunch of other things people could or couldn't add depending on what they wanted to do. So you might put hops in there. You might put some other juices in there. You might add some maple syrup or something like that to kick the ABV up. All sorts of different things you can do with cider. And then we would pitch it for them, get an airlock on there, and send them home with some instructions. And that was basically how we did cider making classes. And obviously the results varied widely, but it would give people kind of the opportunity to try it and see it. And, one of the nice things about making cider at home is you do need a little bit less equipment than for brewing. So it is a little bit more approachable from that side. But kind of like I alluded to earlier, if you want a sparkling cider with a little bit of sweetness in there, that's really hard to do at home from a technical perspective. It's pretty easy to make dry still cider at home. But when you want to do those kind of things that you'd expect to get in the grocery store, it's a little trickier.
Gotcha. I'm curious. You've made probably hundreds of different recipes and varieties. Is there a baby of yours? Is there a cider that you have made, or maybe you still are producing, where it's just like your favorite? It's your go-to. Love it. Number one.
Yeah, totally.
There is. All right, great.
And we make it and we sell it all over the place. And I'm not actually joking about this. It's truly my favorite cider, but it's the Schilling Local Legend, and it's our super approachable, semi-sweet. It's only 5.2%, so I can drink a 6-pack of these. I love the high ABV ciders. Our Excelsiors are probably our most famous ciders. But I drink 1 or 2 of these now. I'm a little older than I used to be years ago, obviously. But the Local Legend, what makes it so special is we're actually bringing in really high tannin heirloom cider fruit from Europe, and we're blending that in with our fresh pressed juice from Washington. And so it's actually got a much more French kind of cider flavor profile to it, but it's still super approachable, super juicy, super crushable. But it drinks way more complex than anything else you're going to get in this kind of, canned cider at a price point category. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I love about it. We also, it's our venue option. So you see a 16-ounce can of this at a lot of venues. So it's just very approachable. And what I love about it is it brings more people into the cider category, but it's not a basic cider. It still is a really complex and interesting cider, but it's still super approachable. So it's a nice way to get someone who's like, well, I've had a cider before and I didn't like it. It's like, well, try this one. Because it's approachable yet complex yet intriguing, and can kind of start people on their cider journey if they want to try other stuff. Or like me, you've gone around the whole circle multiple times, and that's what I've come back to.
Just come back to it. Yeah, old reliable.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure you have.
I love that
like that.
Yeah, I love that saying too. That I've tried cider. I don't like it. It's like, well, you've tried this certain kind of cider, right? Like you haven't tried all ciders. So dip your toes back in. If you're listening out there and you're like, cider's not for me, definitely try this one. Because honestly, I'm loving this big zesty guava lemonade. I'm a big fan of this one. I'm happy that you sent us multiple so that I can continue to drink more
Hell
of these
yeah.
when this podcast is over.
Yeah.
Because if I drink more, I think I might get a little bit too drunk on this show. But I'm curious where you're distributing to. Can I go to Jewel and pick this up, or are there certain stores that you guys are in, or certain areas throughout the country?
Yeah, it really depends on what region you're in. Obviously we're a West Coast brand, so we're kind of focused Colorado West for the most part, but you will find us in other pockets of the country as well. Being a small independent company, the reality is Seattle shipping to Florida or upstate New York or Maine is pretty cost prohibitive. But if you're within 1,000 miles of the Pacific Northwest, you can probably find ourselves at most good retailers, especially with kind of our core products. But we also, if you go to our website, shillingcider.com, there's also a product finder. So you can just type in your zip code and see exactly where it is. And in a lot of states, you can actually order directly through there too, if you want to just get it delivered to your door. So there's definitely some easy ways to find it as well from that perspective.
It's really nice.
Just gonna have to open up a manufacturing warehouse in Chicago and just bridge that gap east west. I think that might be no
tempting. I do
tempting.
love Chicago.
So let's talk about it. The future. So what can people that are following the brand, that they enjoy drinking it? What are some things that are on the horizon, or what does the future look like in your eyes for Schilling Cider?
Yeah, we're going to obviously continue to push the boundaries for, what cider is and how it's made. And from an innovation standpoint, continue to be a leader in that space. For us, we're never going to compromise on quality. And I think one of the other things we haven't talked about on the show too much is, we're really a values driven company. And so as we're growing, we are very much trying to grow in a way that's doing good for our community, our people, the planet. And so as we continue to grow, we really want to show our industry, kind of some of the best practices that everybody can adopt and make an impact for, whether that's having an amazing company culture internally and really taking great care of your people, all the way down to, sustainability practices. So like I said, we were one of the first cideries to sell cider in cans, and that was back when everyone thought we were crazy for it. Now it's over 65% of the industry of cider is sold in cans. And we were definitely a driving force behind that. And the amount of CO2 saved by having lighter packaging that's far more recyclable is immense. We were also recently the first alcohol company in the US to go to an all electric fleet for our sales force. So we have a bunch of EVs running around that are actually fully wrapped in our branding too. So they look really
awesome.
fun. People are always taking pictures of them. But we do believe in doing good and doing well at the same time. And so through our growth, we're not going to compromise on how we take care of our people and how we continue to innovate and be as sustainable as we can. Our long-term goal is to be a carbon neutral company. We're not there yet, but we are taking steps to continue to drive that direction as quickly as we can.
That's amazing.
Okay.
Love to hear it.
Yeah. As long as you have that as your goal and that's what you're working towards, that's fantastic. Anything else you want to plug, Colin? Thanks so much for joining us. Just wanted to, give you an opportunity if there's anything else you wanted to share with our listeners.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. That was super fun. And I would just say, go Mariners. One of these years, we're going to make it.
Yeah, you got the Edgar Martinez jersey on too. So Colin, thanks so much for joining us again. He's Colin Schilling. He's the CEO, co-founder, and Master Cider Maker at Schilling Cider. Colin, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Likewise. Thank you both.
Thanks for being here. Thanks again to our guest today, Colin Schilling, CEO, co-founder, and Master Cider Maker at Schilling Cider. Just a great guy, like a really personable, someone that you just absolutely want to root for, does everything the right way, takes care of his employees. I don't know if he didn't talk about it too much, but a lot of the write-ups say just how great their culture is there at Schilling. Really wants to take care of the people that are working for him. And just like the recipe and everything, he wants to be like
product's fantastic. Yeah.
And he wants to do zero emissions in the future. Like if you see Schilling Cider on the shelves, just pick it up. Really, really, really good brand, good company. We're rooting for him. Evan, MLB Trade Deadline just passed today. We're recording this on Tuesday. Let's go over it. What do you got for me?
So the Cubs get back Candelario, which I mean, he's been on the Cubs before, and was somebody that was hyped up when he was first coming up. I think when David Ross, his first year with the Cubs was the year Candelario was coming up. So
I
think
he debuted in 16, the World Series year. I think that was his debut.
Yeah, so they send back a couple prospects, DJ Hers, Kevin Made, I believe is how you say his name. So who's, single A and a double A pitcher in Hers. That's fine. And I think I like this approach. They also got Jose Cuas for Nelson Velasquez, who came up at a cup of coffee this year.
It was a good bat. Okay. I liked watching
fine.
him. Good bat. He's probably going to be a big leaguer, but
Yeah,
I
he
think
needs some regular playing time, so I think he'll get that over there. Kansas City. And then they traded Adrian Sampson and Manuel Rodriguez to the Rays for Josh Roberson. I think that was kind of like a minor league deal.
yeah, another relief pitcher.
Yeah. So, I think the Cubs took an approach where it was, we're not going to sell, which is fantastic. I think everybody would agree that we love to see that. The Cubs have been playing really well lately. And if you're going to buy small. Don't give up the farm for us to go for it this year. They don't, this team is good. Are they great? Is this the year? Who
True.
knows? But I think picking up a third baseman, which you desperately needed, and whether, if Candelario actually plays third or if he's going to play some first base now that they got rid of Mancini.
DFA'd him.
Yeah, we'll see what happens there. And then I think the biggest move though from the weekend outside of Candelario, who's been really great. Let's talk about him for a second.
He was the biggest free agent bat on the market.
Yeah, I mean, I think him coming over to the Cubs now, he's got like the second highest WAR, on the team outside of maybe third highest Swanson, Bellinger, and then him. He's having a really good year. It's one of his. I think it's a career year for him. So it's good to get a guy who's hot right now, get him back in the lineup. But the biggest move to me was PCA, Pete Crow Armstrong getting promoted to AAA, just one step closer to the big leagues. He's killing it in AA. It's fantastic to see him moving up, and maybe we'll see him in September. I mean, I don't know. To see how he, if he tears it up in AAA, he might be up towards the end of the year to make a push, which
feels
I think would
good.
be really cool.
Feels good to be a Cubs fan again, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah. So those were the moves from today. I think it was good. Buy
I do as well.
Small.
I think it was good too. Like hearing, Jed Hoyer's press conference as well, just like rewarding the team. Like everyone a month ago, they're going to be sellers. This team we're not figuring out, it's not meshing. And then we go on this run. They're all pulling for each other. And like you said, it was small buys. Didn't give up the farm, but also rewards the players in that locker room of like, hey, all right, you've been playing your ass off. Here's a little help. Let's see what you can do. And, is it going to be that story of, a team that doesn't have the stars that just kind of start putting it together? I mean, as we're recording this, they're just absolutely stomping on the Reds. It's like 13-3 when I looked. I think they put up 5 in the first inning.
Huge game for Bellinger again, 3 for 3 right now at the bomb.
When the people that are in charge of putting your team together go ahead and give you more players because they're believing in you, right? And they're rewarding you and they're seeing what you're doing and then it matters. That locker room's got to be electric. Like a tight locker room can win games over talent. And we saw that with the Mets. We see that with the White Sox who are selling all of their talent, most of their talent, right? Because they're just not winning games. So it's good to see that. I'm eternal optimist here. I'm fighting for this team to get in the playoffs. It's going to be awesome if they do.
Man, if you'd have told me at the beginning of the year that the Mets, who spent all that money, I think it was a record free agent spending spree that they went on with Verlander and Scherzer and everything, that they were going to be the sellers and the Cubs were going to be, picking up some pieces at the deadline, I would have told you no way.
Right.
But there were some other non-Cubs moves. Astros acquiring Justin Verlander from the Mets.
Love it.
Getting him back.
Bringing
him back for a little bit of a run.
Won the Cy Young there, I
Jack
think,
Flaherty.
in 19 and 22, and he's on my fantasy team, so we're looking for a bounce back.
Back to a spot. Maybe it feels like home for him. Jack Flaherty went to the Orioles. We'll see if maybe he turns it around.
Love that team. It's a good team to root for as well. All their homegrown talent is just, they're hitting at the major league level, playing at the major league level. It's a fun team to root for.
Yeah, your Padres over there acquired left-handed pitcher Rich Hill. I cannot believe that he still has trade value at his
Cup for life,
40 plus age. Brewers picked up Andrew Chafin. Pretty good pickup, I think, for the Brewers there.
Mm-hmm.
And then for White Sox fans, they got Luis Patino, former prospect from the Rays, for cash consideration.
Big pickup.
So
big pickup.
Hey, see if you can turn that into something. I think that is, it's a small bet that you can make there. Maybe you turn Patino back into who he was. Scherzer went to the Rangers, so there were some big names flipped. Older guys though, so we'll see.
Nothing crazy though. Like nothing crazy. Ohtani didn't get dealt. No like superstars, I would say, got traded.
Yeah,
but just a lot of shuffling, a lot of mixing it around, seeing what's going on. I mean, Scherzer obviously superstar, right? That's big, going to the Rangers. And
think less-
Verlander, once superstar, going back to the Astros. But besides that,
less dramatic
yeah,
deadline
yeah,
than we
yeah.
were expecting for sure.
Good
All right,
for the
Dan, I
Cubs,
got
though.
Yeah, I got a couple fast facts here. I mentioned earlier in the show, Washington produces the most apples, followed by New York and Michigan, but it also takes 36 apples to make 1 gallon of cider. I felt like
It's a lot of
that's kind of a
apples.
lot to
How
make
you like
cider.
them
So you
apples?
can imagine how many apples Schilling's burning through on a regular basis. But that's been our show today. Thanks again to our guest, Colin Schilling, for joining us. For Dan Sloak, I'm Evan Bierman. You've been listening to the Domestic Draft Podcast. If you're listening on Spotify, don't forget to rate the show. You can find us on Twitter at Domestic Draft, on Instagram at Domestic Draft Podcast. Our website is domesticdraft.com, and you can watch the show on YouTube. Just search up Domestic Draft and drop us a sub. Thanks again for listening.
Cheers.